Why is my 9-year-old son being yanked off his bike by two grown men in neon vests while my husband walks out of the house with a smile like he's about to teach a masterclass in regret? That was the moment everything changed. It was supposed to be a simple Sunday afternoon. The kind where you sip lemonade on the porch, half listen to birds chirping, and half yell, "Keep your elbows in!" at your son as he proudly pedals around on the path near the greenbelt. It wasn't just any day either. Toby had finally mastered biking without training wheels. I had my phone ready, waiting to record his final turn like a proud mom collecting digital trophies. But instead of celebration, we got ambushed. Toby was riding past the bushes, grinning ear to ear, when two HOA enforcers materialized like budget mall cops out of a sitcom. They weren't police, security, or even respected neighbors. One was Greg, a man who thought a walkie-talkie gave him superpowers. The other was his nephew Darren, who looked like someone had glued a fake badge onto an oversized traffic cone. They were blocking the path, yelling at Toby to dismount immediately. He looked confused, maybe thinking it was a joke, until Greg actually grabbed the bike's handlebar and Darren reached out and lifted Toby off like a sack of potatoes. My lemonade hit the ground before the glass did. I bolted across the lawn, phone flying, heart racing, yelling his name. They froze mid-explanation, and that's when I saw it. Greg standing over my son, yelling about greenbelt violations and unauthorized recreational equipment. They talked like Toby had brought a tank to a tea party. I reached them in seconds, pushing past their outstretched arms, and dropped to my knees next to Toby, who wasn't crying, but looked pale and stunned. He muttered, "They said I was trespassing, Mom," as if he'd committed a crime by being a happy kid on a $40 bike. I stood and turned to them, fists clenched, voice shaking. I didn't even know what I was going to say yet, because I was too busy trying not to swing. But before I could speak, another voice floated in from the porch. Calm. Controlled. Slightly amused. "Hey honey," my husband Tom called out, stretching as he walked down the steps. "Something happen out here?" I will never forget how slow and deliberate his steps were. Not angry. Not panicked, just confident, like a man who's fought bigger battles and knew exactly how this one would end. The two enforcers instinctively backed up a step. Tom reached Toby first, placing a hand on his shoulder, checking his elbows and knees, then looking me dead in the eyes to make sure I was okay. I nodded. He nodded back. Then he faced Greg and Darren. "You two want to tell me what made you think dragging a child off a bike was the right call today?" Greg puffed up like a dollar store action figure. "Your kid was violating HOA Code 11.4. No recreational wheels on the greenbelt. We've had too many complaints about damage to the grass. We're authorized to act." Tom blinked once, then smiled. Not a happy smile. A calculating, let me line you up for a verbal judo takedown kind of smile. "Authorized by who?" Darren pulled out a paper. An actual printed sheet of rules, the kind that looked like it had survived a coffee spill and a highlighter massacre. "Right here," he said, shaking the paper like it was the Magna Carta. "This says we can enforce community safety." Tom took the paper. Read it. Turned it around and pointed. "This says, no rollerblading during peak hours. Doesn't mention bikes. And definitely doesn't authorize adults to lay hands on a child." He folded the paper neatly and handed it back like it was radioactive. Greg stammered, clearly losing momentum. "Look, we've had issues with kids causing accidents. It's our responsibility to keep things orderly. It's not personal." "It's about to be," I said, crossing my arms, still standing between them and Toby. That's when Tom tilted his head slightly, cracking his neck like a guy preparing to deliver a TED Talk on why you shouldn't touch my kid. "You two might not know this, but I work with combat readiness teams. That means de-escalation, crowd control, and how to identify a real threat." He took a step closer. "Let me assure you, a 9-year-old riding a bicycle is not one." Greg's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Darren started checking his walkie-talkie, which wasn't even turned on. I almost laughed if I hadn't still been vibrating with adrenaline. Tom turned to me. "Call the sheriff. Let's get a real authority on this." I nodded and dialed. Greg panicked. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, there's no need for the police. We're all neighbors here." Tom raised an eyebrow. "So now you remember we're neighbors." They tried to backpedal. "We just meant well, maybe it got a little heated, but no harm done." I pointed at my son. "He's 9. He weighs less than your backpack. And you dragged him off a bike for touching grass. You don't get to oopsie that." As I spoke, I realized something else. This wasn't an isolated incident. I'd heard whispers from other parents, minor scuffles, rude warnings, flyers taped to doors. The HOA had been escalating, and today was just the latest mess. But now they'd messed with the wrong kid on the wrong day. Because today Tom was home early. A small crowd started to gather. Neighbors who'd seen or heard the commotion. Phones were out. Greg and Darren were sweating. One woman in a visor shouted, "Is that the same guy who took my nephew's scooter last week?" Another neighbor added, "They threatened to fine me when my toddler brought a tricycle outside." Tom stepped aside and waved to the crowd. "Anyone who's had an issue with these guys, feel free to stay. The sheriff will be here shortly." The enforcers turned to leave, muttering about clarifying with the HOA board. Tom didn't stop them. "Let them run," he muttered. "This isn't over. But next time, we're not just handling it on the sidewalk." Toby tugged my hand. "Are they going to come back, Mom?" I smiled down at him and ruffled his hair. "They might. But next time we'll be ready. And next time, you'll be the one teaching them how to ride." He grinned. Tom grinned. "And I?" I took out my phone and hit record. Because what happened next was going to need documentation. And popcorn. Lots of popcorn. The front door clicked shut behind us as we stepped back into the house, our son still holding tightly onto his handlebars like someone might try to rip the bike from him again. I sat him down on the couch and handed him a juice pouch while Tom quietly opened the hallway closet and pulled out our home security system tablet. His movements were calm, precise, like someone going through a checklist. No raised voices. No frantic scrambling. Just a subtle shift from family man to strategist. Toby didn't notice, he was too busy watching cartoons, but I knew that posture. That deliberate stillness always came before one of Tom's tactical responses. And today, I could tell, his patience had an expiration date. Within minutes, Tom had pulled up the security camera footage. There it was, clear as day. Toby riding along the greenbelt path. Greg and Darren stepping into frame like they were reenacting a police takedown for a community theater audition. You could even hear their voices if you turned the audio up, Greg shouting "Stop," like he was detaining a felon. Then the part that made my blood boil again. Darren's hand grabbing Toby by the arm and lifting him clean off the seat. Tom replayed that moment twice, then hit export. The file went straight to his cloud folder, then another copy to mine, and one more to an old colleague who worked IT security for local law enforcement. He didn't even say it out loud, but I could read his thoughts. There would be no chance this footage disappeared or was lost if the HOA came snooping. He finally spoke, calm as ever. "You should post this to the neighborhood group. Just the clip. No captions. Let the community watch." I nodded, uploaded the video to the private community Facebook page, and waited. 5 minutes passed. Nothing. 10 minutes in, the first comment popped up. "What the hell is this? That's Greg from enforcement." Then came another. "They did this to my niece last week. Took her skateboard and threatened a fine." And another. "Same guy who warned my son for having sidewalk chalk. Called it unauthorized public messaging." The post was on fire within 30 minutes, and before long, neighbors started tagging each other, sharing stories, and posting their own photos, flyers, messages, even footage of Darren inspecting a baby stroller for rule violations. Tom scrolled silently through the growing thread, jaw tight, arms crossed. Then he stood and said something I hadn't expected. "I'm calling Kevin." Kevin was a former student of Tom's, now a sheriff's deputy who owed more than a few tactical tricks to Tom's combat training program. A few years back, Kevin got injured on duty and Tom helped rehab him through mental drills and physical training until he requalified. The bond between them was strong. When Kevin picked up, Tom explained everything, short and to the point. I couldn't hear Kevin's exact words, but the laughter through the speaker told me he was just as outraged. 10 minutes later, we had confirmation. Kevin would come by the next day, casually, without uniform, just to talk and assess. Not as an officer, but as a friend, with a badge. Later that night, I noticed a black SUV circling the street slowly. Tom did too. It was the kind of HOA car they used for patrols, complete with a magnetic logo slapped onto the side and a cheap orange light bar on top that flickered like it hadn't worked properly in years. It rolled past, paused in front of our house, then moved on. Tom didn't react, but I saw him tap something into his phone and slide it onto the charging dock with a little more intention than usual. That was the moment I realized something else. Greg and Darren weren't just rogue volunteers. Someone higher up in the HOA had given them permission, maybe not on paper, but certainly in spirit. The kind of green light that comes in private emails and off-the-record meetings. And now that the video was out, someone was nervous. Around midnight, a notification popped up. A message from the HOA board's official Facebook account, posted in the comments of the video. This incident is under internal review. We urge residents not to speculate without full context. Community enforcement remains a vital part of maintaining order and safety. The responses were swift and furious. One mom replied, "Your community enforcers laid hands on my kid, and I'm speculating that you're all about to need lawyers." Someone else chimed in, "This ain't the neighborhood watch, it's the neighborhood SWAT." Greg and Darren were the kind of men who thought a clipboard made them king, but they were losing their grip fast. Especially with over 100 comments roasting them for everything from costume-grade security gear to power tripping on retired HOA budget. The next morning, we kept things quiet. Tom spent an hour in the garage, tightening bolts on the fence and checking the side gate lock. Not paranoid, just precise. It was almost funny how calm he stayed. Toby went to school like nothing had happened, even telling his teacher that some grown-ups tried to steal my bike. But it's okay, my dad's turning into Batman. I tried not to laugh when I heard that. He wasn't wrong. That afternoon, Kevin arrived. No uniform, just a flannel shirt and jeans, carrying a small tablet and wearing a smile like he'd been waiting for this kind of ridiculous drama. Tom briefed him in 10 minutes flat, and they sat on the back patio while I served coffee. Kevin watched the video again, then leaned back and said, "So this Greg guy thinks he's judge, jury, and bike repossession unit?" Tom chuckled. "He thinks he's protecting America, one playground violation at a time." Kevin got serious after a beat. "Technically, that's assault. You can't lay hands on a minor over a rule that doesn't even exist in state code. That rulebook they're using? It's not enforceable unless it's ratified properly and filed with county compliance." I checked. "It's not." I leaned forward. "So what can we do?" Kevin looked up. "Let's get statements. Yours, the kids, maybe a few neighbors. Then I'll bring it to my captain. No need to arrest anyone yet, but if they so much as touch another kid, I'll have legal cause. Meanwhile, keep the footage safe. Oh, and one more thing, don't delete anything. Emails, messages, flyers. You're building a case now." Later that evening, I noticed the video had been downloaded, reshared, and screen recorded by dozens of neighbors. One of them even captioned it, "Karen Patrol goes full tackle on child for riding bike. Welcome to Suburbia 911. That version hit Reddit within hours. The comments were brutal and hilarious. One said, "Plot twist. HOA enforcer gets tackled by Greenbelt grass golem summoned by child's tears." Another said, "Greg's vest has more authority than his IQ." But my favorite was, "Who drags a child off a bike in 2025? Is this HOA or a rejected Marvel villain club?" By bedtime, the HOA had gone silent. No comments. No clarification. Just radio silence. Greg and Darren hadn't been seen all day. And yet somehow, we knew this wasn't the end. Because if there's one thing power-hungry people hate more than being exposed, it's being laughed at. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we'd give them both. The morning air was unusually quiet, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. I could feel the tension before I even opened the curtains. Our video had gone viral overnight, not just in the neighborhood group, but across the city thanks to some very active parents and a few angry Reddit threads. The HOA, which usually flooded our inboxes with reminders about overgrown grass and improperly parked trash cans, hadn't sent a single update. The silence was louder than a siren. Tom was already up, calmly sipping his coffee as he scrolled through community forums, his phone dinging every few seconds with new messages from neighbors. Some were supportive. Some were sharing their own horror stories. A few were screenshots of a private HOA board Zoom meeting invite that somehow leaked onto the internet. That's when things really started to get interesting. Tom stared at the screen, then looked at me with a slight grin. They're meeting tonight. Emergency board session. Agenda item number 1: Community enforcement incident and social media fallout. I took a long sip of my tea and nodded. So they're going to try to bury this, I said. Or blame us. He nodded back. Probably both. And that's exactly what they did. We didn't plan on crashing the meeting, not at first. But then one of our neighbors, Melissa, who used to be on the board before resigning over ethics issues, sent us a link. Not just a link, a backdoor one. It let us join the meeting as a silent observer under an alias. Melissa had never trusted the current board, especially not Greg's sister, who just so happened to be the new HOA president. According to her, the enforcement crew was handpicked, unsupervised, and given way too much leash to chase around residents like they were running a suburban boot camp. Tom clicked the link and entered the session under the name Anonymous Renter. I sat beside him as the screen filled with familiar faces trying very hard not to look panicked. The meeting started with some forced pleasantries. Then the president, Cheryl, leaned in with a sigh. "Let's just get this out of the way," she said. "The video has created unnecessary chaos, and we need to address the misinformation before it turns into a lawsuit." One of the older board members chimed in, "Is it really misinformation? I mean, Greg physically removed a child from a bicycle. That's not policy, it's assault." Cheryl frowned. "Well, we don't know what the child was doing. The footage doesn't show everything. We need context." That was when I nearly yelled at the screen. Luckily, Tom remained calm. He just leaned back and whispered, "They're digging themselves in deeper." Another board member, clearly nervous, asked, "Should we consider suspending Greg and Darren until we complete a review?" Cheryl dismissed the suggestion. "That would be an admission of guilt. We need to focus on controlling the narrative." My eyes narrowed. There it was. They didn't care what actually happened, they cared how it looked. And then Cheryl dropped the line that would come back to bite her. "Honestly, this all escalated because of that mom. She's hysterical. Probably overreacting. These people always twist things when they don't get their way." Tom clicked the record button. Silent. Efficient. Cold. As the meeting spiraled into blame games and public relations strategies, someone else joined the Zoom call. The screen flickered and a new participant appeared, unmuted, camera on. She looked crisp, composed, and official. The tag below her face read, "Eve Sandoval, Governor's Office." The entire board froze. Cheryl stuttered. "I'm sorry, this is a private," but the woman spoke over her. "Not anymore. This meeting is now under observation due to multiple civil complaints filed against your board in the last 48 hours, some of which involve minors and unlawful detainment." It turned out, Melissa had forwarded the video and meeting link to a contact in state administration. And that contact? She was none other than Emily Sandoval, a legal advisor with the Governor's Advisory Board on Civil Liberties. The room went dead silent. Even Greg, who had now joined the meeting from what looked like a car, sat frozen with his mouth slightly open like a kid who just got caught with his hand in the cookie jar and 3 crumbs on his face. Emily continued, "We will be requesting a full audit of your enforcement policies, your approval process for patrols, and a review of all incidents in the last 6 months. Consider this an official notice. Anything you say or attempt to delete from this point forward may be included in the investigation." Cheryl looked like someone had just pulled the fire alarm in her brain. She stammered, "This is an overreach. We're just a homeowners association." Emily responded, "Then perhaps you should start acting like one." The call ended a few minutes later, with the board scattering like mice. Greg disconnected mid-sentence. Darren, who had been visible in the background of Greg's screen eating chips, tripped over his chair trying to hide from the camera. Tom leaned back, hands behind his head, and smiled like a man who just watched a tactical maneuver executed perfectly. That night, the energy around the neighborhood shifted. People who used to walk past with quiet nods were now stopping by our gate, asking questions, sharing their stories, thanking us for standing up. One dad showed us a flyer Greg had handed him a week ago, warning that his son's excessive basketball dribbling was a disturbance to the community. Another woman had a voice memo from Darren claiming that sidewalk chalk art violated Section 6.3.1 of the HOA's Visual Consistency Policy. The best part? That section didn't even exist. Tom gathered every piece of evidence. Videos, photos, flyers, voice memos, texts, and backed them up across 5 platforms. Then, quietly, he started building a document called Operation HOA Transparency. It wasn't just about Greg and Darren anymore. It was about exposing an entire structure that had forgotten it was meant to serve, not control. The following morning, Tom posted a flyer across the neighborhood Facebook group and on actual wooden signs around the park entrance. It read, "Free Neighborhood Civil Rights and Self-Defense Workshop. Saturday, 10 a.m. Taught by a former military combat instructor. Know your rights. Know how to stand your ground." I laughed when I saw it. "You really gonna teach all these people to go full tactical on the HOA?" He smiled and kissed me on the cheek. "I'm just going to show them how to stand up without backing down." Within 2 hours, over 40 people had RSVP'd. Parents, teens, seniors. Even the yoga moms who usually avoided anything controversial. One comment summed it up perfectly: "I'm bringing my whole crew. HOA forgot this isn't a dictatorship. Let's ride." As the day rolled on, word continued spreading. Some neighbors even offered snacks and water bottles for the event. Others volunteered to help with flyers or tech setup. This wasn't just a workshop anymore, it was a movement. The neighborhood was waking up, and the HOA was about to face a whole community that wasn't afraid to speak, to stand, or to ride their bikes anywhere they damn well pleased. Saturday morning arrived like the opening scene of a feel-good rebellion movie. The kind where ordinary neighbors step out of their quiet lives and show up with lawn chairs, snacks, and a sudden thirst for justice. The park near the Greenbelt, the very spot where Greg and Darren had yanked Toby off his bike just days before, was now bustling with more energy than a 4th of July parade. There were moms in yoga pants, dads in polo shirts, teens with notepads, retirees in sun hats, and even a guy in full camo who claimed he was just here for the vibes. And standing in the center of it all, like a general prepping his troops, was Tom, holding a whiteboard with the words, Neighborhood Defense 101, scribbled across the top in red marker. He didn't raise his voice or do anything flashy. He simply greeted everyone with a nod, introduced himself as a concerned neighbor who teaches people how to avoid getting run over by bullies in vests, and began with a quick demo on the difference between legal authority and pretend power. People leaned in. Phones came out to record. Someone passed around juice boxes. It was surreal and hilarious at the same time. But underneath the laughter was a shared understanding. We were done being intimidated by laminated rulebooks and HOA henchmen. Tom walked the group through real examples from our neighborhood. He showed printed screenshots of the fake citations Greg had issued, none of which had any legal standing. He played a voice memo from a neighbor's voicemail where Darren threatened to call community services over a toy drone. The kicker? Community services didn't exist. The group roared. Then Tom switched gears. He demonstrated how to calmly de-escalate a situation, how to document an incident legally, and how to file a complaint that actually goes somewhere. It wasn't about confrontation, it was about awareness and control. Then came the part everyone was waiting for. The bike ride protest. Dozens of kids lined up at the edge of the greenbelt path with helmets, streamers, bells, and signs duct-taped to their bike. One read, "Free the path." Another had a cartoon of Greg with a giant red X over him and the words, "Not my sheriff." And there at the front of the line was Toby, wearing his GoPro helmet and a superhero cape someone had made out of an old tablecloth. His shirt said, "I pedal for justice." At exactly 11:30 a.m., the protest began. The kids took off, riding slow circles around the HOA office just a few blocks away. Behind them, parents walked with signs, chants, and cameras. Some residents stood on porches clapping. Others joined mid-walk. By the time they completed the second lap, even the local news van had pulled up. A reporter hopped out with a cameraman, clearly confused at first, then utterly delighted to be covering something that didn't involve potholes or zoning drama. Tom kept the energy focused and peaceful. No shouting, no swarming, just a steady, organized display of community unity. The news crew interviewed a few parents. One mom said, "I didn't think I'd be out here today, but after what happened to that little boy, we all realized how out of hand this HOA has gotten." Another added, "We pay dues to live in a community, not a compound. We're here to take that back." It was the kind of soundbite that made news editors sit up and pay attention. Inside the HOA office, however, it was a different story. The blinds were shut. No one came out. A few people claimed they saw Cheryl peeking through the top slat with binoculars. Greg's car was nowhere in sight. Darren was rumored to be hiding at his aunt's house. No statements were issued. No apologies. Just silence, which, by this point, was practically an admission of guilt. But the silence wouldn't last. That evening, the governor's office released a short statement confirming that an official investigation into unlawful civilian enforcement and abuse of authority by a residential governance body had begun. The story had reached more than just local media. Statewide outlets picked it up, spinning headlines like "Bike Protesters Roll Over HOA Tyrants" and "Kid on a Mission Sparks Suburban Revolution." The HOA's board members were suddenly facing real scrutiny, not just from angry residents, but from actual state officials with the power to issue subpoenas. The next day, legal notices began arriving at the homes of every board member, including Greg and Cheryl. Witnesses were being asked to submit written statements, and Tom was contacted by a civil liberties attorney offering to represent the affected families pro bono. We weren't the only ones who had video footage. Turns out several neighbors had recorded their own interactions with Greg and Darren, some dating back months. It was a digital avalanche waiting to hit, and the snowball had officially been kicked downhill. But what surprised us the most was how the community changed overnight. That Monday, people who barely spoke to each other were now swapping stories, organizing meetings, and laughing at memes of HOA Enforcer Barbie and Clipboard Commander Greg. A local bakery even released a donut called the Darren Dunk, a jelly-filled mess that explodes when you bite into it. We bought a dozen. Tom, meanwhile, received an invitation to consult on revisions to the HOA charter. A formal request, signed by 3 of the 5 remaining board members who had suddenly decided that perhaps it was time for change. It was poetic. The same HOA that tried to control our kid was now asking his father to help rewrite the rules. Tom didn't brag. He just accepted with a nod and said he'd bring note. Probably a whiteboard too. One of the final moments of the week came when the sheriff's office, now fully involved, hosted a town hall meeting to address the complaints and outline the investigation's next steps. It was packed. Tom stood in the back, arms crossed, watching as one resident after another stepped forward to share what had been building up for years. Intimidation, false fines, selective enforcement, even HOA favoritism. It all poured out. When the sheriff finally took the mic and said, "This isn't about a bike anymore. This is about power being abused in a place meant to feel like home," the crowd erupted in applause. We looked around and realized something undeniable. We hadn't just defended our son. We'd woken up an entire neighborhood. And they were wide awake now. As we walked home under the fading sunset, Toby riding ahead with his cape trailing behind him, Tom took my hand and smiled. "They thought they could scare one family," he said. "They didn't expect the whole street to show up." I laughed. "They didn't expect you either." He looked ahead at Toby, who had just popped a wheelie. "No," Tom said softly. "They didn't expect him." A week later, the HOA that once ruled over the neighborhood like an overzealous referee in a t-ball game was practically unrecognizable. Their once mighty enforcement crew had vanished. Greg and Darren were no longer patrolling the sidewalks with their neon vests and hollow threats. Cheryl, the president who had called me hysterical during the infamous Zoom call, had officially stepped down, citing health concerns, in a community email that sounded suspiciously like a lawyer had helped draft it. The message was thinly veiled damage control, complete with an apology that blamed communication breakdowns and community misunderstandings, but never once used the word assault. No one was buying it. The investigation from the governor's office was now in full swing. 3 officials had already visited the neighborhood in person, discreetly conducting interviews and collecting evidence. A subpoena was issued for all HOA records involving enforcement complaints, volunteer personnel files, and digital correspondences. Melissa, our whistleblower friend and former board member, had already handed over damning documents that showed Greg and Darren were operating without any formal approval, essentially self-appointing themselves as community enforcers based on verbal encouragement from Cheryl and 2 other board members. That, combined with the footage of them manhandling a child and threatening residents, created a perfect storm of legal liability. As a final nail in the coffin, Kevin, the deputy sheriff and Tom's former student, had submitted a full report of the incident with sworn testimonies from witnesses, including several parents and even a few teenagers who'd recorded clips of past altercations with Greg. With mounting pressure and public outrage, it was only a matter of time before fines, suspensions, and possibly charges were handed out. But while the legal machine did its slow, grinding work, something else remarkable was happening. Our neighborhood had come alive. Tom's self-defense and legal awareness workshop had grown into a weekly event. Every Saturday, residents gathered at the park with water bottles, folding chairs, and curiosity. Tom started bringing in guest speakers. A civil rights attorney, a retired mediator, even a local journalist who covered HOA abuse stories. The sessions were empowering, hilarious, and educational. People weren't just learning how to push back. They were learning how to push forward. It was like group therapy meets revolution with a side of lemonade. And then came the charter rewrite. A new election was announced to replace the vacant board seat. Tom was asked repeatedly to run. He declined, saying his place was behind the scenes, not behind a podium. But he did agree to serve as a consultant for rewriting the HOA bylaws, ensuring that no future board could ever unleash unchecked power on its residents again. The new draft included clear limits on enforcement authority, transparency requirements, and, Tom's personal favorite, a clause that made it explicitly illegal for HOA volunteers to physically engage with any resident for any reason. It was nicknamed the Toby Clause. The day the new charter passed by an overwhelming community vote, we celebrated on our lawn. Neighbors brought cookies, sparklers, and in one case, A full mariachi band hired by a very enthusiastic grandma who declared she'd waited 20 years for this moment. The air was light, the mood electric. Kids rode their bikes freely around the park, shouting victory slogans like, "No more clipboard cops," and "Greenbelt is for everyone." Toby led the charge, this time wearing a new shirt we had custom made. It read, "If you can read this, you're too close to my bike." That evening, we watched the sunset from our porch, the sound of laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Then came the moment I didn't expect. A small, nervous knock at our gate. I looked up and saw Darren. No vest, no clipboard. Just a nervous young man holding a brown envelope. Tom stood and walked to the gate, opening it slowly. Darren swallowed hard and said, "I came to apologize. I didn't know what we were doing was illegal. I was just trying to help my uncle. He told me it was just community service. I didn't mean to hurt your kid." Tom didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at him. Finally, he said, "It's not me you need to talk to." Then he called for Toby. Toby came out, helmet still on from his latest joyride, and looked up at Darren. "Hey," he said. Darren knelt down. "I'm sorry for grabbing you like that. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't mean to scare you. You were just riding your bike, and I got carried away. I was wrong." Toby looked at him, then glanced at Tom, who nodded subtly. Then he said, "Okay. But don't do that again to anyone, or my dad's gonna make you do push-ups forever." Darren laughed awkwardly. "Fair enough." He handed Tom the envelope. Inside was a notarized statement admitting wrongdoing, which Darren had submitted to the investigators voluntarily. Maybe there was hope for him after all. A week later, the governor's office released its findings. The HOA had violated multiple civil codes, failed to properly vet volunteers, and knowingly allowed enforcement actions that exceeded their authority. The board was ordered to undergo mandatory retraining and legal compliance workshop. Greg was fined and permanently barred from participating in any future HOA leadership. Darren received a formal warning but was spared harsher consequences due to his cooperation. Cheryl? She quietly sold her home and moved out. No one waved goodbye. The final community meeting of the season was held under string lights in the park. It felt more like a block party than a meeting. Tom spoke briefly, thanking everyone for standing together, for refusing to be bullied, and for turning one child's bad day into a turning point for an entire neighborhood. I spoke too, though mine was more emotional. I talked about fear, about that sick feeling I had watching strangers drag my son off his bike, and how that fear turned into power when we decided to stand up and not sit back. There were tears, laughter, and more than a few parents who admitted they'd been waiting for someone to say out loud what we all knew. It was never about the bike. It was about being heard, respected, and safe. As the crowd began to disperse and the music picked up again, Toby zoomed past on his bike, cape flapping, bell ringing. A few kids chased after him. One of them shouted, "He's like the mayor of bikes." I smiled. Maybe not the mayor, but definitely the spark that lit the match. Tom leaned over and whispered, "You think they'll remember this 10 years from now?" I looked out at the families smiling, the kids riding, and the street finally feeling like home again. "They'll never forget it," I said. "And neither will we."